We have a lot of open seats in the front of the room. If anybody chooses to move up, but let's calm down. Remember, this is a live stream broadcast, so quiet of the room is appreciated. And also, panelists, please remember to use your microphones. Before I introduce the panel, remember we have the Truth and Integrity in State Budgeting Report, our latest edition, out there in the break hallway. Please take a copy, and remember to take a copy of the Rainy Day Fund working paper that you got in your folder. We are moving on now to a really interesting topic for state budgeting, something you don't think of as a budget risk, but if a state, city doesn't have an educated, trained workforce, they're either going to have to invest in it retroactively, or they're not going to generate the tax revenue. So we have a terrific panel today, moderated by Tom Ross, our president, to deal with this issue. Great experts in the area, and with that, panel, take it over.
Thank you, Bill. First, let me join everybody who's been up here in thanking the Atlanta Fed and Raphael Bostic for allowing us to be here and for partnering with the Volcker Alliance to make this event possible. We're really quite appreciative of all they've done to make the day go so well. You know, we've heard about pension problems, healthcare problems, climate change, infrastructure issues, all these things facing government, facing cities, states, the United States, all the problems that they bring with them. Guess what? It takes people, talented people, to solve them and to deal with them. And that means a workforce that's talented, educated, prepared for the future, whether it's a private sector workforce, a public sector workforce, or a nonprofit sector workforce. They've all got to be working together if we're going to solve the problems that we're facing. So what we're going to talk about for a few minutes is workforce development, the challenges, solutions perhaps, but also the consequences if we don't get it right for budgets. Technological, demographic, economic, structural shifts are surely going to threaten, in fact they already are threatening, to disrupt the labor market and the workforce. Again, true in the private sector, public sector, and nonprofit sector. The impacts on economic stability, on budgets, on the sustainability of government operations, the ability to deliver services, to take care of residents, are all looming threats to our communities and to our nation. These are issues that the Fed has looked at for sure here in Atlanta. The Alliance certainly has been involved in looking at them, but there are lots of people thinking about the issues around workforce. The economic declines that can happen as a result of labor disruptions will, if they do occur, really seriously reduce state revenues, both from payroll, income taxes, sales, property taxes, whatever. And it will at the same time, if that labor force gets disrupted, it could well increase expenses of government for benefits of one kind or another for displaced workers. So falling revenues at the same time of increasing expenses is not the best combination for business or governments or anybody else. So we want to talk about this and talk about how we can get ahead of this issue, or at least understand it better. I want to take just a moment before turning it to the panel to talk a second about where governments are. Because I think this is not a risk that people think about quite as much as they need to. From our perspective at the Volcker Alliance, we think government is facing already a serious workforce crisis. A couple of data points in the private sector workforce. About 25% of the workers are under 30 years of age. In the federal government, that number is 7%. In their IT workforce in the federal government, it's 3%. That's pretty scary. At the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, the chronologically gifted end of the spectrum, where I find myself, and some others in this room may fit that as well, in the federal government, a third of the workforce will be eligible to retire in the next 5 years. And we are seeing those who are eligible to retire at faster rates than they've done in the past. So you're losing a lot of your experienced workforce. This is true in the private sector too, by the way, although the government workforce is older on average than the private sector workforce. And in government, we're not attracting the young talent that we're going to need to face all the problems that we've heard about today. These are serious issues for the delivery of government services, for the solution of government problems that we know we're facing. The picture is not a pretty one right now for government workforce. There's also the whole issue of reskilling. How do we go about taking the talent we have and providing the professional development and the skills they are going to need to retain them, first of all, but to continue to be productive workers in the future. Again, very difficult issues we're working on with the Volcker Alliance, and have a new initiative, Government to University initiative, that we hope is going to at least create interest and focus on the issue of the pipeline. But others are working on this as well. There's a lot to be thought about and learned about the issue, and we have an incredible panel to help us do that. And I'm going to introduce them briefly. Then I'm going to give each of them about 5 minutes to tell you a little about their perspective on the issues. And then we're going to open it up for questions. I have lots of questions, but I'm sure you may as well. And so we're going to, unlike the previous panels where I get to ask a bunch of questions first, we're just going to open it up. And I'm sure that this will be a really interesting exchange. So joining me on the stage, and I'll start the closest to me, is Kaye Husband's Feeling. She is the chair of the School of Public Policy at the Georgia Institute of Technology, the Rambling Wreck. She specializes in science and innovation policy, the public value of research expenditures, and underrepresentation of women and minorities in STEM fields. She was, in the past, a professor at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. She was also a professor at Williams College. She was the inaugural program director of the National Science Foundation's Science of Science and Innovation Policy Program. She is a member of the executive board of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and a AAAS fellow. She holds a doctorate in economics from Harvard and a bachelor's in mathematics and economics from the University of Pennsylvania. Seated next to her is David Altig. He is Executive Vice President and Director of Research at the Atlanta Fed. In addition to advising the bank's president on monetary policy and related matters, he serves as a member of its management and discount committees. He is an adjunct professor of economics at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, has served in the past as director of the National Association of Business Economics and as vice president and associate director of research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. He earned a bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Iowa and his master's and doctorate in economics from Brown University. Finally on our panel is Marti Fischbach, who is the Director of Employment and Economic Assistance in Dakota County, Minnesota, with oversight of all public assistance programs, child support, and employment services. Her extensive public sector experience over the past 20 years includes working in 3 counties as well as at the Minnesota Department of Human Services. She is what I like to say is a public servant extraordinaire. That is, she has committed her life to public service, but she's done it in an innovative way that has really been an inspiration. She is, for example, had the opportunity to be involved in integrated service delivery framework development. During the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, she participated in the planning and implementation at the local level and did so quite well. She has a master's in public affairs at Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. So we have people who can talk about the future of work, who can talk about the impact on budgets, and who can talk about the expense side of the government with public benefits that could be impacted. So I'm excited about this. I think you'll find it interesting, and we're going to turn it now. There's some handouts, by the way, from Kaye and Marti on your tables. Be sure everybody gets one of those. And I'm now going to turn it to Kaye to begin with her discussions, and then we'll move down the table. And at the end, we'll be ready for questions. Kaye.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation. My comments will be somewhat brief. I'm a professor, so of course we get to talk a lot, but I'm going to constrain and going to reel it in a little bit. You do have the handout on the table, and we can talk later, and I can give you a little bit more information, but my comments will revolve around three things. Technological change and how that affects employment. So my part of this is really to talk about the challenges that occur as technological change, especially in cognitive technologies, take place. We also want to address here what we don't know and things that we really need to find out, especially related to the public sector and public administration, and then talk very briefly at the end about how to deploy some of these activities. So first, I want to talk about cognitive technologies and the future of work. And what are cognitive technologies? It's sort of, instead of just saying AI or artificial intelligence, there's also the use of machine learning tools and natural language in terms of processing administrative records and other things that exist in the public sector. And we can add to that also, not in the area of cognitive technologies, but sometimes we're looking at high velocity, high volume data that are used also in terms of trying to make decisions and decision making in the public sector. And so as these opportunities are now very well established and increasing in use in the public sector, what does that mean? So cognitive technologies and sometimes also big data will eventually fundamentally change how government works. We must consider, therefore, the workforce within the public sector and how to reskill that workforce. So now we're not just talking about how these technological changes affect the general workforce in the United States or around the world, but we're also looking at not just the private sector, but how this is changing in the public sector. I want to quote something that a good colleague of mine, Pris Regan from George Mason, wrote, and you can find it in there's a report, AI and its impacts on public administration. That's the report this is found in. And she says, the opacity of AI systems in any area of public administration challenges the traditional responsibilities of administrators, regardless of substantive policy area or whether decisions directly involve citizens. So there's an emerging literature now on not just that these are new ways of doing business, but also what does it mean for the skilling and reskilling of the workforce in the public sector. Policymakers face choices, and they need to understand how to apply these technologies in this area, and we need to think through, are we marginalizing our workers, or are we empowering our workers with these new capabilities? That is really important to assess. And in assessing this, we need to understand, are we creating value, or are we just cutting costs? Are we enabling our workers, or are we replacing our workers? And obviously, that is something that matters tremendously throughout all of our organizations. And I want to add to that something else. we need to think about what is the value to our citizens of these changes. And so you see there in the notes, the public value, assessing that, not just the economic return on investment. I'm an economist, and that's the way I usually think, but we have to think beyond the traditional parameters of what it means to consider value. And what is the public value? How does this affect our citizenry? If you flip over, if you're following with me, you'll see some of the unknowns. Who's producing this new knowledge? Who gets to decide how it's deployed and what is it? And how does it, who is going to kind of wield the decision-making tools on how these technologies are employed? That matters. Who wins, who loses? What is the future of work in our own research that comes in parallel and provides the evidence for this? That is essentially important as well. One thing that I remember in 2007, when I was in the DC area, I was working at the National Science Foundation, and we were trying to deploy the science of innovation policy, right? And we were talking to one of the agencies, and I won't go into which agency it was, but we had all of this capacity and thought about how to use evidence in the process of doing work at the agency, how to make that part of it, not just the evidence for what we're going to do for the citizenry, but how do we deploy that within the efficiency processes within the agency. And we had a lovely conversation, and we were very proud of ourselves in terms of frameworks and tools and data that we could use. And at the end of the conversation, we said, well then, how are we going to get to work on this? How are we going to do this? And the response was, these are great ideas. We don't have the budget, and we don't have the capacity. We don't have the people yet trained up to do it. This was in 2007. I would hope that I could go back to that agency and say, well, things have really greatly changed, but I see from the smiles and nods and tilts of the heads in the audience that no, we're not there yet. But this is what we need to consider. It's really important to know that government just cannot be 20 years behind the private sector in moving forward toward the future of work. The last couple of points I want to make are these. Do we run the risk of reinforcing existing biases, even introducing new types of biases in the age of artificial intelligence or the deployment of cognitive technologies? In other words, we know what the distribution is of women, underrepresented groups, people with disabilities, and I usually work on STEM fields. We know what those numbers are today. As these things change, will we see that same underrepresentation in the future? We should not. So as we're making these changes are rolling in, and we're trying to deploy them within our organizations. We also need to keep in mind that we don't want to reproduce some of the disproportionate benefits that have occurred in previous times. Last point, how do we connect the call for public service to advances in science, technology, and innovation? That's the question that I would like you to ponder within your own circumstances in two ways in which I've seen this. I'm on the executive board for NASPA, the Network of Schools of Public Policy, Affairs, and Administration. And one of the things that we've been talking about a lot is, about 285 schools are part of this network. And in our own curriculum, how are we going to deploy the use of technology in the service of the public? And they are looking at the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and thinking about three in particular. I just want to bring those three up. Water and sanitation, the mayor last night talked about that a lot. That is one of the goals. Secondly, clean energy, affordable energy. We just heard about that in the previous session. And, Dennis, infrastructure, sustainable cities. That's another major goal that well over 100 countries have signed on to that we want to see deployed. So as we look at this throughout our curriculum and at universities, those are the things we want to train our students up in to be able to do this in the service of the public. And the last point is the National Academy of Public Administration also has been looking at this and thinking about how to deploy these technologies in the service of the public. But budget matters, and that's why it's so related to what you're going to hear about now, is that how do we then purposefully deploy funds and human capital in this arena? So that's all I have to say today.
So the previous discussion was about physical capital. This one's about the other important piece of capital, human capital. But I could use the same sort of title that was for the previous session for what comments I'm going to make, quantifying risk and reaping the rewards. And I want to talk about that in the context of a very specific example related to the risks and rewards to workforce development efforts, in particular workforce development efforts that attempt to take the unskilled to higher levels of skill through some sort of programming that we all know about, that every community is involved with in some sense, but which has a particular set of problems that I'm going to identify. So here's the specific one part of the specific sample. This is a model of a standard sort of workforce development model that involves a career pathway that takes someone who may be working in a minimum wage job with only a high school education and then begins to move them up a skill ladder through successive training programs from, in this case, certified nursing assistant, which is better than minimum wage but barely, to then higher levels of skill that represent what in almost every community in the United States is what we have called in the Federal Reserve System opportunity occupations. Those occupations that pay a higher than median wage, but you can get to without a college degree. So I want to talk about a particular person that we're trying to place into this career pathway. So here is that person. We call her Leah. She's a single mother of 2 children. She's age 25. She has children ages 4 and 6, and she lives in Chicago. She lives in Chicago because that's where I was yesterday, and so the data that I have this is the most recent, and also because it turns out Illinois is a particularly perverse place or something, and it's a very extreme example of the problem that I'm going to kind of identify. She's working as in a minimum wage job in a movie theater as at the concession stand. And importantly, she's assisted by a variety of public assistance programs, which are listed there: food stamps, Medicaid, FHA, housing vouchers, child care assistance, and so on. So I want you to put on your hat of a financial planner and think about what the return to moving this person up through this career pathway might be to 2 entities, the public entity and the private entity. Here's the public return to moving Leah up this career pathway. This is for a single person, the return to the federal government, to the Illinois government, and to the Cook County government collectively, from moving Leah from the minimum wage movie theater job to the certified nursing assistant, then from certified nursing assistant to licensed practical nurse, and then from licensed practical nurse to registered nurse. So you can see that this number for this one person in some kind of long-term sense is substantial. It's, $400,000 for one person. So right away, we kind of want to say, okay, we need to get Leah moving up this career pathway. So now we're going to put on our hats as financial advisors. And we're going to try to convince Leah that she ought to move up this career pathway. So where did I get these numbers? I got these numbers out of a financial planning piece of software. So I plug in what I expect Leah to earn, what the government is going to get back in 2 ways. One, from higher taxation of her moving up into higher income occupations, and one from the release of the need to provide public assistance in the meantime. So with our financial planners hats on, we know a couple things. We know basically what the market wage is in Cook County, Illinois, that can be expected out of these certified nursing assistant positions and the LPN positions. And I'm giving you one comparison of this sort of job ladder, the jump from CNA to LPN. So think of this as you. You're the person who is getting advice from this piece of software and the person running it about whether or not you should make this investment in your own human capital, in your own skill development. And it looks sort of like a no-brainer. My lifetime prospects increase by 40% if I make this investment, which is a pretty good return. Well, you're going to look at this and you're going to say, well, you know, wait a minute, there's something else in here that you're maybe not factoring in. I want to think about kind of other sorts of benefits are in the background here from the government, for example. So let's factor in Social Security and all those sorts of things. And that's a good thought. That's what you should ask of your financial planner. But that's not what's relevant to Leah. Because remember, Leah has a whole bunch of other things that she is collecting from the government along the way, which are, by the way, means tested. And these income paths have some implication for the assistance package that she will be eligible for from the government. So I got a pretty good piece of software, and I'm a pretty reasonable financial advisor. So I say, okay, we'll factor that in. What does it look like when you factor it in? That's what it looks like. That's what Leah can expect by moving up the job ladder once we take into account the fact that she is going to lose public assistance along the way as she makes these investments and earns higher and higher incomes. So you notice a couple things right away. One is, geez, this thing slopes downwards. It doesn't slope upwards. That feels a little uncomfortable. The other thing you notice is that for a decade in Leah's life, investing in the licensed practical nurse path doesn't pay off. The payoff is down the road. So you have 10 years where the lower skilled job is dominated by the higher skilled job. This is the risk to that reward that I was noting at the outset in this person's particular case. So here's what we know. We know the public return, the return to government, is large. Now we know the return to Leah is questionable. I don't know. If I'm sitting in Leah's shoes, I'm not so sure this is feeling like such a great deal. It comes about, of course, by means testing the benefits, but that's an appropriate thing to do. So on the one hand, you have the desire to provide assistance to people who need it. On the other hand, you have some notion of accountability and some notion that we want to direct those resources to the people who need them. But the very mechanism by which we try to balance those things is creating this picture. So I'm an economist, and my job is just to say depressing things and leave it at that, and that's what I'm going to do. But now I can hand it over to someone who actually has some solutions.
Hello. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm usually hanging out with a lot of human services people, so this is a little different, and I am enjoying it thoroughly. I think I'm going to pick up right where you left off. So on your tables, you should have a handout with this, another kind of way of looking at this benefit cliff. And this is an example in Minnesota, in Dakota County actually, where you can see that as people make more money on the axis on the bottom, then they lose benefits. And so you really literally lose money when you make more money. So we it is an issue that we need to get past. I think to the example of Leah, and you can get past it, but it takes a lot of money to get past it, and it takes higher than in that example than like what the LPN would make for that family size. So this is a real issue. It's a disincentive for people to get off of the program, even though there's lots of other disincentives to stay on the program. It's very difficult to comply with all these different programs. I mean, all the programs that he had listed, each have their own set of rules, each have their own set of applications and re-eligibility, and in some cases, in the case of MFIP, which is the TANF program in Minnesota, it's a monthly reconciliation if you make money that you have to do. So it's hard work to stay on public assistance. So how should we tackle this? It's really gonna take, first and foremost, a different way of looking at people. We really need to believe in people and give them opportunities that support them and empower them. Things like financial counseling, credit repair and building credit, banking, budgeting, asset building, all those kinds of things. Those are not things that we typically talk about in these government programs. They're things that we're adding to the equation to really illustrate why people would want to continue to look for other opportunities. And then there's tools that we are experimenting with in that solution space, such as this cliff forecaster. So back to this visual, if you see that these are real jobs in Dakota County, making a certain wage on the bottom. And so looking at those career paths, if you had somebody, you would say what makes sense for you, and really be thinking mostly about the person and what might help them. And then once they find something that they're interested in, then we would kind of build the track from there, or recommend how to get there. So that's one of the pieces. Right now in Minnesota, there is a 2.7% unemployment rate. So we should be fine, right? Well, that's not for everybody. We have 6.5 if you're Black. And if you're someone with a disability, it's more like 10% of the unemployment rate. And so there are some big disparities. So that's an area where we can really focus on people. They're disproportionately represented in the public assistance caseloads. So that's one of the things that we're looking at. So some strategies are, we really want to look at whole people. So on this visual, we call this the social determinants of health. And that's really looking at the whole person. So people are not just healthy because they go to the doctor. People are healthy because they have homes, they have transportation so they can get to work, they have food and nutrition, they have safety, they have education, environmental health, all those things. And frankly, if the stem and the roots are part of the infrastructure, different kind of infrastructure that I'm talking about here today, if those are part of the infrastructure, we don't naturally support that whole person. We may support them in different ways through these different programs and different applications, but we don't do it in the whole person. So that's one of the first things we want to really tackle, is how do you work with somebody and how do you work with the whole person. Other strategies specific to this economic mobility piece is raising awareness with employers, making adjustments to their hiring criteria for educational attainment, criminal backgrounds. It would not be a panel without mentioning Colorado and their cannabis. They have,
What are you looking at me?
I don't know why I'm looking at you, David. We had an employer on our panel that, on our workforce investment board, who has some sites in Denver, and they do drug testing. And so the policy for the company is you can't have marijuana in your system. Well, they're relooking at that because that's just no longer a practical criteria for employment. So those are some of the things that employers are looking at. And the labor shortage, this is in raising awareness with employers. They really need to look at populations overlooked in the past, which include the people that I've talked about already, but also people with a criminal history. Some career pathways. I think your example of the healthcare is a good one. So it's figuring out that living wage jobs in the vicinity. We're doing an interesting thing in Dakota County and also Hennepin County and Ramsey County, which are St. Paul and Minneapolis counties, have been working with an organization, a nonprofit, who finds a high opening job, and then they create a customized training to go with it. So we've actually hired people out of this program who are coming to be public assistance workers, so financial workers is what we call them. And it's been a very successful program, and they've done other programs where they target high opening positions. So that's been one example. Another really creative example in coming out of rural Minnesota in the Southwest is they have had a lot of jobs and not enough people to fill the jobs, and they brought they sent busloads from the metro area down to this community, not just to look at the jobs, but to look at the whole community. Is this a community that appeals to you? Would you be interested in relocating here? And so really trying to look at that from a different perspective. We're also looking at some person-centered pilots. One of the things to tackle that benefit cliff issue is to look at benefits, kind of take the rule book, throw it out and start over, and to say, okay, well, if we want to incent people to work, if you make more money, you make more money, period, then let's try a different way of administering benefits. So with the exception of healthcare, all of the benefits that David had listed on that previous slide, you would consolidate into one benefit, and then people could use it as makes sense for them, and then they could fit in things like asset building, that sort of thing. And then you would disregard money when they work so that they, and then you would continue to give them so that they kind of stay on a trajectory where they would continue to have, they would make more money when they make more money. So that's a thing we want to experiment with, and we're hoping to get a pilot put together that we would be working on in about a year. So those are some of the things that we're really working on and interested in continuing, and really to look at the messaging on all these ideas a little bit differently. The return on investment for the whole community, I think, is a really important message that we in human services do not always focus on, but I think that's an important thing that we need to incorporate more.
Great, thank you. So there are microphones that'll be passed around. If you have questions, before anybody raises their hand, Mark, I have one question I have to ask first. And it's sort of hopefully a little bit more context setting, and that is, if you saw the news this morning, you saw that Amazon has announced they're going to retrain 100,000 workers, specifically in operating robotics in their distribution centers and preparing, I guess, for drones to do delivery and all that sort of thing. Problem is they have 300,000 workers. How many of those are going to be displaced when the 100,000 get retrained? And what does that mean for the economy overall? What does it mean for public benefits? And that's one company. You think about the impact of robotics, of artificial intelligence, and what it's going to do. What does it mean for all the people who are displaced, and therefore what does it mean for government and government budgets? Comments? I know you have some.
Well, okay. Well, and what I'm looking at here is something I can hand out, a different handout, but I didn't want to clutter. And it basically is about artificial intelligence and the future of work and some thinking on that. And one of the pieces, one of the nuggets here is not enough data on jobs and skills. I mean, we really can't answer that question well enough right now. And we're hoping that, and then I really say hoping, that some of these changes actually will augment the work of the current worker and not displace the worker with no other capability going for that particular individual. But we don't know the answer to that just yet. And unfortunately, that's not a very encouraging answer. On the flip side, maybe to put a little bit brighter light would be bringing the universities capacity and other kinds of, so, two-year colleges, other types of training capabilities. I know for the federal government, they were looking at sort of the SES, sort of the Senior Executive Service and the Federal Executive Institutes as ways of doing this and the reskilling that's necessary, and possibly looking at those capabilities coming alongside with the companies, but also coming alongside with government agencies to help with the reskilling so that people can continue to be gainfully employed. But the short answer that I have is not that encouraging, which is I don't know, because I don't think we've observed the data well enough to know what that displacement factor will be versus augmenting ongoing work that will continue to have some people gainfully employed, and what the timing would be also in terms of displacement.
Yeah, so I'll add just briefly to that. So the answer of people like me is always do more research, because if your job is doing research, you like more research. But there is some really interesting stuff that's being done by the people at the economists at IBM, in conjunction with some people you may have heard about, Daniel Rock and Eric Brynjolfsson, who are thinking hard about these things. And they're using AI to figure out what's going to be replaced by AI. And so they basically go into burning glass data, I think it is, and figuring out bundles of skills and projecting which sets of those skills will and will not survive the machine learning AI assault that is actually coming. So the technology is going to help us figure out this question about technology replacing labor, I think, or labor replacing technology.
All right, question, Mark.
So the little presentation that David did is absolutely critical, I think, to understand. And what it shows me is that the private sector has been able to outsource a whole lot of the cost of having employees to the government when you have that big an imbalance. So I asked the question that drives economists nuts. Should we raise the minimum wage to deal with that?
I do have an answer to that. So one answer is just quantitative. So if you take Marti's, we're also working on various versions of Marti's benefit cliff picture that's on your table, and I don't think it shows so much up in this one, but in many cases, I know this is true for Chicago, it's true, we've done one for Nashville, we've done one for Broward County, Florida, and if you look at the current minimum wage in those states, and then taking into account these benefit cliffs, project to $15 an hour. $15 an hour is not, you're not better off than you are at the current minimum wage. So that is not going to be the solution. I think you put your finger on what part of the solution is. Marti's already kind of explained what I think one part of it is. We just need to get more sophisticated about the bundle of benefits that we're providing people. But I think it's absolutely true that sooner or later employers are going to need to understand that these are the problems of their employers, these are the people they want to skill up, problems of the people they want to skill up, and they have to be part of the solution. There are employers actively doing this all over the country, but to this notion of not having the data, it's uncoordinated, it's sort of ad hoc, and we really need an effort that begins to build up a database, if you will, of best practices about here are your employees' problems, and here's how they can be resolved in a good business proposition.
I want to just add a tiny,
Go ahead.
a tiny bit to that, and that is, I know it sounds a little cliche to say we need more information, which is what, sometimes we end up having to say. But the ways in which that information can be gathered has to involve the public in that process of gathering the information. It can't be just behind a screen or just the streaming data or something like that, but the public have to be involved. The communities have to be involved. So this may be a network of networks scenario, something that we were talking about yesterday. This could be a set of observatories where the information is gathered, but also we can see how it's deployed. So I think we have to really begin to actually take action on these things and not just say, well, we think we can, but actually begin to gather the information. But the interesting answer that you just gave, David, was that it definitely isn't $7.15, right?
And I just want to also add that the other pieces of the puzzle that, if they're not part of the equation, are going to be difficult too. You also need transportation and you need housing. So if you don't have affordable housing and you don't have a way to get there, then it's even harder for someone that's making $15 an hour or less to do the whole package. So that's another big piece of the equation.
Yeah, we got the microphone back here.
Rob Moore, Scioto Analysis. Thank you so much for coming and talking about this really important topic. Dr. Feeling, in particular, you brought up the problem of the policy analysis workforce and the public administration workforce. And at the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis conference in March, some people were touching on the topic of automation of policy analysis and automation of benefit cost analysis. And I was just wondering what y'all's thoughts were on the prospects for automation of repeated policy analysis and how that might be able to improve access to policy analysis, particularly for lower resource local governments.
Well, I think if the data are available and good data, then that could be useful. But here are some of the problems. Some of the automation processes have biases inherent in them. And so therefore, we can't just assume that you turn loose a machine or a computer or something and we're gonna spit out the right answer. And so the curation of that, and even in terms of the training of the models and how that is done, has to be done with a lot of wisdom. Otherwise, we will continue to put the same biases back in the system. So I think also what I've seen, and I wouldn't call this automation so much, but is the use of data that are transactional data that we do have in our midst. But how do we use that to make good decisions? In a university setting, we get lots of grants, and we have lots of data, not just on the grant money that's come in, but what's the workforce that's involved in it? Who are the vendors that are providing information for the tools for the labs? Where our graduate students go, we know that, and there's an organization in Michigan that is working on those types of data to not just say they're gonna come in, we're gonna warehouse them, and then that's it at each university, but how collectively can we look at that information and understand what that mechanism is for federal funding, and usually I'm on the federal side, so federal funding, and what is the utility of that throughout the system. So my answer to you is kind of twofold. One, you just can't turn the machines loose and assume that it's gonna get the right answer. I don't believe that's true, because we can reproduce some fundamental biases that have been in there in the past. The second part is, it's not just the machines, it's actually the types of data that we have access to, and being much more comprehensive and knowledgeable about how to use those administrative records in various levels. So again, I'm used to looking at federal, but in many different levels. And then the utility of those could be very useful in terms of helpfulness with that evidence-based policymaking.
Yes. Can we get a microphone? Yeah, thank you.
I hope my question isn't elementary in design, but I hear very much conversation surrounding the responsibility of the employer with regards to minimum wage. But I would like for someone to speak to me regarding the impact of raising minimum wage and on the cost of goods sold, and whether or not that is going to create an ever-widening effect of people's ability to acquire those cost of goods, well, acquire the goods that now this wage is now a part of, and if that increases the income and wealth disparities.
So I'm not sure I understood the question.
If you go to any fast food restaurant, they're selling hamburgers for like 2 pennies. And if you then turn around and tell the person that they've got to pay this person $15 per hour so like the minimum wage is built into the cost of goods sold.
Yeah, so I have already kind of expressed some skepticism about the minimum wage being the solution. Look, there was a model when I was a kid that, I guess applied to people of more means to begin with, but that was, you started out on minimum wage on your way to something else.
Exactly.
And the whole career pathway that is the logic of a career pathway. You start there on your way to someone else. So I'm very skeptical of this notion that we find some magical level of the minimum wage and then we're done. And that stops our problem. I think that mindset isn't going to get us where we want to go.
If I might follow up with this last piece, I think that if, going back to what you talked about, the social determinants, if there are ways that you can incline people to educate themselves, to accept more responsibility, personal accountability for their own livelihoods, and I am a positive person with regard, I grew up low income and all types of stuff, but I think that we have to encourage people to become educated and then create opportunities for people of varying levels of intelligence to be able to participate in these spectrums, as opposed to just creating more government programs.
Yeah, I got this ugly stop sign up in front of me, but so the one thing I will say though is that it is incumbent upon us giving that advice that we understand the real circumstance of the people that we're giving the advice to. So when I said put on our hats as financial advisors, I meant it, which is, the proposition that we deliver to people has to be a proposition that rational people would say makes sense. And in the environment where we have a configuration of policies that are not designed to make that proposition look good, then that's a problem. And the answer is not just get rid of the benefit stuff, and I'll give you a complete example why that is. Suppose we take away the housing benefits. Well, all of a sudden you're going to be forcing people to go out and find housing away from where the jobs are, and then we're stuck again, back in the same old spot. So we got to rely on people like Marti to kind of bail us out of this.
Okay, join me in thanking the panel.